All right, so 62% of the people say no to this bailout. The policies that you are trying to put forth, people are hearing, they're feeling good about everything you're doing. Then your prime minister, he stepped down or his party lost, right?
No, no, no.
No? Do I have
No,
this
my
backwards
prime
now?
minister, yeah, what happened was he overthrew his own government, more or less. Not literally, but metaphorically.
Yeah.
What he did was to say to me in his office that night, once a few hours, a couple of hours after the result came through, and I was celebrating with my wife out on the street, and I walked into the prime ministerial residence, and everybody was glum. Why are we glum? We won. And of course, I knew because it was there was a process leading up to this, and I had a lot more than just a premonition. I knew he was at the end of his tether, and he was about to capitulate.
Mm-hmm.
But I had expected that the 62%, David, would have revived him, and he would have wanted to honor it. Instead, he was very much down in the dumps, and he said to me, "Yanis, it's time to surrender." He was expecting the yes to win, you see. It would have been a solution for him. He would have said, "Oh, on the basis of what the people are saying, I'm stopping the fight." And I said to him, "Look, I tried. I spent 2 to 3 hours trying to stiffen his lip, trying to bolster his psychology, and it wasn't working. It was already decided with other people, members of the cabinets, that they would do an internal coup. They would turn the no into a yes." He asked me to stay on. I said to him, "There's no way I'm going to sign that agreement, especially after we brought our people out onto the street and we energized them and we made them give us a fantastic mandate. And I'm going to turn that mandate into its opposite by signing to this. No, I don't think that, I'd much rather chop off my arm than do that." And at that point, I decided I submitted my resignation. The next morning, he reshuffled the government. And it was just like a collective lobotomy. My comrades who up until that moment were saying, we're going to be steadfast, we're not going to succumb. They all started sort of chanting the new mantra that they saved the country from bankruptcy. From bankruptcy, in other words, they meant from closed banks, by accepting the last 5 years of extending and pretending. And this is what they're doing to this day. And you can watch them. It's like it's a tragedy. It's an ancient Greek tragedy in the traditional ancient Greek sense of watching good people descend one after the other the steps to hell.
Yeah. So I guess when I said your prime minister lost, I guess that's what I meant. He won effectively, but he lost. And then, so for you, I think what the amazing through line is that one of the reasons that I wanted to have you on, and so many people had asked me to have you on, is because they wanted me to do more on left economics. But interestingly, for the half hour or so that we've been talking, really what you're saying is that in a situation like this where reality has really crashed everything, that right economics are more effective. Has this changed the way you generally feel about economics, or do you think that this instance is so unique?
But remember, I'm a confused economist on purpose. I believe that if you're not confused, you're not thinking. And I'm an eclectic economist. People concentrate on my Marxism, but I keep saying, and they don't take the first adjective seriously, that I'm a libertarian Marxist. So my influences are just as much Hayek and von Mises as it is Marx and Keynes. Now that sounds strange. How can you have influence from Hayek, Mises, Marx, and Keynes?
Yeah.
I think that it's the only way of understanding capitalism and being sensible about it. Each one of us, of those thinkers, has given us very important tools and concepts. So Marx was the first economist to come up with the theory of the business cycle, of the boom and bust. Mm-hmm. There was no theory of boom and bust before that. Adam Smith didn't have it. David Ricardo had the theory of stagnation, but no theory of cycles. The idea, when we talk about disruptive technologies, that's Marx. If you read even the Communist Manifesto, it's the way that technology disrupts the social relations of production and creates a new mode of production. It went from feudalism through the steam engine destroyed feudalism and brought in capitalism. In my estimation, robotics, 3D printers, and so on will bring the end of what we know as capitalism, bring in some other mode of production. I don't know what we're going to call it. Hopefully, it will be a good world to live in, but it will be something very different.
Right.
There will be no purpose for corporations anymore because economies of scale will have been devastated by technology. So that's what I learned from Marx. This is crucial for me from Marx. Also, the idea there is no such thing as a natural economic system. It's an evolving thing. That's from Marx. Schumpeter got it all from Marx anyway. If you read Schumpeter, who is a doyen of the right, he himself admits that even though his politics were right-wing, his economic theory would not have existed without Karl Marx. When it comes to Keynes, the idea of a coordination failure, where you have a pile of savings, sort of a pile of savings and a pile of debts, and the savings are not invested into productive activities that will generate the incomes that will extinguish the debts. This coordination failure is Keynes, and nobody else has explained it as well as Keynes. Hayek was fantastic, and von Mises to do things. Firstly, explain to us the true nature of the market and the true utility of the market. The market is not just a little mechanism for pushing prices to the level of costs. It's a way of disseminating information when information is very, very complicated to disseminate through some central process. The Austrian idea, the von Mises idea, that when you have a bankruptcy, you do not overcome the bankruptcy loans and through taxpayer-funded bailouts. This is one that I think is essential for all of us to understand. So these are my influences. And one of the great tragedies of the 20th century is that the libertarians and the Marxists ended up with followers that they did not deserve. So, for instance, you know the story about Marx. When he was old and just before he died, there were these young left-wing people, economists, who came to see him with, to pay their respect to the great man, and they were telling him that, we are Marxists and that we believe X, Y, Z, and he was listening to them. He said, the only thing he said to them was, well, if you're Marxists, I'm not. So poor Marx did not deserve.
Those are great dying words.
Yeah. He didn't deserve Stalin. He didn't deserve, in the same way Christ did not deserve the Spanish Inquisition, right? Marx did not deserve the Soviets. Similarly, the liberals and the libertarians do not deserve all those people who speak on their name. Margaret Thatcher, who usurped the notion of free markets and shrinking the state in order to build up the state and make it more centralized and more authoritarian than ever.
Mm-hmm. So basically these labels that we use, we need them in a certain way, right? Like you've mentioned a lot of labels here. It gives us a sort of framing of all this, yeah. But we're entering a time where none of it makes sense in a traditional way anymore. Is that fair to say?
Look, the world is a very complicated place. So we need different, smart, sophisticated concepts in order to make sense of it. That was never easy. If you and I were sitting here, or not through Skype, but face to face in the 1920s, late 1920s, or after 1929, we would be having exactly the same amount of trouble understanding what was going on then than we do now. Mm-hmm. And again, we would have to borrow from the great ideas of great men. They were usually men back then, about the workings of capitalism. There's nothing new there. What I find interesting and at the same time satisfying is that during the worst of times, like the early 1930s, or now, there is a possibility for you and I, even though we come from different political parts of the spectrum, or parts of the political spectrum, mm-hmm. to sit down and find common ground. This is a silver lining of a very bad period.
Yeah, I mean, and that's very much what I've been trying to do with this show. So I think it's interesting. I think twice you mentioned that this is a type of coup d'etat. Do you really feel that Greece is that there's been a coup? I mean, I think when people think of a coup, we think of a military invasion usually. But do you feel that Greece has autonomy anymore, really?
No. The Greek government has less autonomy than a small town in the Midwest.
Wow.
Less autonomy. The mayor of a small town in the Midwest in your country has more autonomy than the Greek prime minister does at the moment. And I've experienced that. And let me give you a few examples, right? The state has already legally, through acts of parliament, forced upon parliament at gunpoint. The gun was not the real gun, it was the banks. But, I have an expression. When I was growing up, when I was around 7, there was a coup d'etat in Greece, a proper coup d'etat.
Right.
One you would recognize a coup d'etat. There were tanks on the streets. The police broke down people's doors, abducted people, ended up in football stadia or various prison camps and so on and so forth. So that was a coup d'etat using the tanks.
Mm-hmm.
The one I experienced was a coup d'etat using the banks. And the latter is more subtle and therefore more sinister, because I remember, I have vivid memories of living in a dictatorship with the military out there manning various junctions in the city center, banning any concentration of people, including more than 3 people, burning books that they didn't like. Just a fascist dictatorship, right?
Mm-hmm.
But there was hope, David, then. Hope that is now missing. Do you know why? Because you could identify the authoritarianism. All you had to do was to step out and look at the army. You could look at the secret policeman hiding behind his newspaper, watching over your house. You knew what the enemy was. And you thought, okay, well, all we have to do is we have to overpower them and we'll be free. Now, it's more difficult to see where liberation will come from, because you come out to the street, you don't see anything. But there is fear. As we speak, my successor in the Ministry of Finance, who was my friend for many years and an academic colleague, I can assure you that there's not one piece of legislation that he can push through Parliament without the approval, if not without the dictation of that piece of legislation, by a certain fellow called Thomas Wieser, who is sitting in Brussels. He's an Austrian. Nobody has heard of him, but he's effectively the governor of Greece. Every single piece of legislation has to go through Thomas Wieser. And let me talk about, for a second, about the institutionalization of the transfer of sovereignty, of freedom. When I moved into the ministry, the tax department was part of the ministry, has always been part of the ministry. Unlike in the United States, where the IRS is separate from the Treasury and it's answerable to Congress, the tax department was part of my ministry. So I was responsible for it. If there was any scandal, including our IRS, I would have to appear in Parliament and be answerable for it. But I had no control over it, no information of what they did. The head of the Greek IRS was appointed by the creditors.
Wow.
And was only dismissible by the creditors. So, as you Americans say, no taxation without representation. I had representation and responsibility without any control. Now, the same thing happens with our banks. The banks have all been bailed out by the Greek taxpayers with money that the Greek taxpayers borrowed or were forced to borrow from the Germans, the Slovaks, the Italians. So the Greek state retains a majority holding of all the Greek banks, and yet the Greek government has absolutely no say in the running of the banks. Do you know why? Because the Troika, the creditors, passed the money on from the European taxpayers to the Greek taxpayers to bail out the banks on condition that the shares would be non-voting, that the shares that the Greek state would take in exchange would not have a vote, and would be deposited with the so-called HFSF, the Hellenic Greek Financial Stability Facility, some institution that was created, purpose-made for this, whose personnel would be appointed by the creditors. So
yeah,
we paid for the shares of the banks. They have no votes, and we don't even hold them. Same applies to all Greek public assets. Can you get that? Imagine your nation's assets, public assets, the roads, the beaches, the mountains, the national parks, your heritage. Imagine if that was all put into a special vehicle and its 5-member board of directors was controlled by the creditors. And they could decide to sell whatever they wanted to sell so that they could take the money as creditors. So it's a state under occupation.